So I meet people on this journey all the time who are these lapsed atheists who are now, they've become disillusioned with liberal humanist values. They've realized it's a dead end. It doesn't actually bring life. All we got by abandoning the Christian story and replacing it with a technological story is a lot of confusion, culture war, mental health crisis. You know, it's basically been a really bad thing. And so everyone gets that. Everyone sees that we can't go back. But where do you go to? Something's changed in the atmosphere. There seems to be this new openness.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. Inspired, if you're new to us, is all about meeting different connections of friends of mine from across the spectrum of human experience. And I'm just sick to death of being relentlessly bombarded by negativity and bad news in the press. It just induces fear and cynicism and depression and apathy and what we need is to feed ourselves good stuff. And I think that's why the podcast has been so fruitful. It's so encouraging hearing about what is going on around the world, what people are up to. And I've got no doubt you're going to be inspired this week because we've got with us the wonderful Justin Brierley. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for having me, Simon. It's a pleasure to be on the show. I've heard so many good things about it, have listened as well. So really delighted to be with you.
Oh, thanks, bro. And we were trying to work out how far we go back. We reckon it's about 25 years to when you were in your student days with what became your wife, Lucy, at Oxford. And I came to an OIQ event, and
that was when I first heard about your ministry, and just some of the extraordinary stories you were sharing. I mean, I remember lots of the students getting really excited about it, and then I've just obviously kept tabs and track what you've been doing ever since. So it's wonderful to be talking to you.
Well, thanks, bro. And I've really enjoyed your podcast, and we'll give masses of plugs and be talking about that in due course. So let's just crack on with it now. Don't know much about your background. Was it a fairly conventional upbringing?
Not entirely conventional, because my parents both became Christians kind of in the UK version of the Jesus People revolution. So they were both kind of hippies. I don't know if they were both at Oxford University as well, but they very much became Christians at university, partly through the ministry of St. Aldate's Church. But they actually joined quite a radical Christian sort of commune in their early 20s, and I was born into that. They left that eventually in the 1980s and then started to go to more conventional kind of charismatic evangelical churches in the most formative years of my life, I'd say. But yeah, there was very much there was a real committed Christian upbringing there. I have 4 sisters, and so we all went to church with my parents, and eventually that faith became my own in my own sort of mid-teenage years.
Do you look back to any key moments where they did something, so I don't know, looked a bit nuts, but it was clearly God-led?
I think with my parents, it was just sort of that example of definitely that consistency. I think it goes quite deep when you do see your dad kneeling down in prayer next to his bed with his Bible open. Obviously he talked to me a lot about faith and and everything, but I think sometimes seeing that, seeing someone in the quiet of their own room, just taking time, it does have that kind of impact on you. I'd say, obviously, my own faith also was inspired by a lot of people outside of my family and my parents, particularly a youth pastor called Paul, the church I essentially grew up in, and had my sort of early, I'd say, personal encounters with God. There was one particular youth weekend away when I just got hit, basically zapped by the Holy Spirit, essentially. And suddenly the world came alive. That was definitely a kind of, unlike my wife, who's kind of would say there was just a dawning awareness of God, I did kind of have one of those more wham bam moments where, the lights went on and I realized this was true. I wanted to pursue God. I wanted to pray. I wanted to, and people around me said something's changed. And so, I had one of those kinds of moments aged around 15.
Was that in a talk, or how? Go on, just dig into that a bit.
It was just an evening of kind of ministry that was being shared in this very small youth group led by this youth pastor, and I just had an experience where I was prayed for, and all these emotions came out. And I'm not a particularly emotional person, if I'm honest, but I had this sort of this weeping and then laughter and just all this stuff happened. And I remember looking back at it and sort of almost looking down at myself thinking, this is so weird. Like, this doesn't normally happen to me. But I can tell you from that moment on, something shifted in my soul. So I don't tend to actually often talk about that experience because I'm more interested in the fruits of these experiences. But
Sure.
it definitely was an experience that had quite a profound effect upon me and led me really kind of from that point onwards. I was kind of captured by Christ. And there was obviously a lot more along the way, lots of learning, growing, mistakes to be made. And in a sense, my intellectual side had to catch up with the experiential side. But that was, that kind of that moment in that youth camp, however many years ago now, 30 odd years ago, was pretty important.
Yeah, and it's good, isn't it, to have the experiential, to be with the more cerebral, because, when I think of you, I think with your interviewing of world's famous atheists and all sorts, you're writer, speaker, broadcaster, all those different roles, it tends to be on the more cerebral end of things. So good that it's good to point back to times. I like it in my faith journey that there are times when absolutely undeniable stuff has happened and you think, oh, yes, Lord, you are so real. Yeah. So you end up at Oxford. And you talk about wrestling with periods of doubt. Share about that?
Yeah. I mean, inevitably, when you go to a very secular university, I mean, Oxford does have a great Christian union, as you know, but obviously a lot of secular peers around me, living in a house with non-Christians, you get challenged in all kinds of ways. And so it was a period when my faith was definitely being tested intellectually. People asked me all those difficult, tough questions that people ask. But it was kind of, in those late teens, early 20s that I really discovered the intellectual depth of Christianity as well. I'd been raised in a church that was wonderful in terms of really engaging the spiritual life and the experiential side, possibly not so much with the kind of more rigorous intellectual side. And so discovering that through Christians that I met at Oxford, through starting to read people like C.S. Lewis, who I'd of course read the Narnia stories as a kid, but discovering mere Christianity and the problem of pain and some of his more sort of rigorous apologetic work, that really helped, I think, to start to put some of the intellectual pieces together and help me to, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, give a reason for the hope that I have to those who were asking me. So that was all an important part of the thing. I remember distinctly one particular term, though, where I honestly did question it all. And I was like, have I just imagined this all? Was it just all in my imagination? And I couldn't tell you exactly what happened, but all I know is that sometimes doubt does wash up and then kind of recedes again. And I guess I just found, actually, no, there is this really good intellectual core. And it was hard to deny, even though they are subjective experiences, I couldn't deny what I had experienced as a 15-year-old as well. Yeah. And the fact that I saw this happening for other people as well. So for me, it was kind of that bringing together of that intellectual side and that heartfelt experiential side of faith.
And you found Lucy at that time, your soulmate, a bit on that?
So Lucy was studying theology at Oxford. We were actually at rival colleges, so we were a bit of a Romeo and Juliet story. She was at Trinity, I was at Balliol. But we actually met, not really in Christian circles. I was playing the role of Harry the Horse in a production of Guys and Dolls in a student production. And she had been roped in to do backstage stuff and makeup. And so we met, believe it or not, over a makeup brush backstage. And anyway, the rest is history, as they say. And we discovered each other. And yeah, we were so fortunate to find each other early on in that sense, because we got married, shortly after university. We went on a sort of gap year before we settled down to jobs and family and everything else. Spent 8 months in Namibia, which was an amazing time. And just allowed us to kind of grow together in a way. Sure. And so we've always seen our life as a joint ministry. We've grown together in all kinds of ways since our early 20s, since we were married nearly 24 years ago. So that early sort of period of our life in Africa was really special because there were all kinds of things that God did and moved in special ways that we've sort of been able to take with us into the rest of our life.
Yeah, go on, share a few of those.
Well, it's just kind of, there's ways in which I'm sure you can appreciate you have to trust in God in ways that you don't necessarily have to trust when you're in a kind of prosperous, infrastructure of Western culture. One story that particularly has always stayed with me and I've told a few times, which almost feels like an angelic encounter. I'm not sure if it is, but it's like we decided once, rather foolishly with a friend who was visiting us, to go to a game park, which was 100 or so miles down the road, Etosha National Park in Namibia. And we were a bit underprepared because we got a kind of the local bus that could take you basically fairly close to the park, but it basically dropped you still several miles from the actual entrance. And so we got dropped there, I don't know, sometime in the mid-afternoon. And we didn't really have a plan for how we were going to get from there, the rest of the, I don't know, 10 or 20 miles to the actual entrance to this park, where we did have some accommodation booked. And we were just trying to sort of flag down passing traffic. But there were very few cars on this road, and none of them seemed willing to stop us. None of them were turning down, the path. And so nightfall, started to draw in, and we were getting a bit worried. And this game park, it's not like, doesn't have like high fences to stop the wild animals. There are wild animals around kind of, at that time, and they come out at night, So we started praying at this point, like, Lord, we need someone to come and help us sort of get to this. And anyway, this car sort of pulls up, and it's this young South African guy. He says, I was driving by earlier, and I saw you guys on the side of the road, and I just carried on. But I felt God tell me I needed to stop and come back and help you guys out. And we were like, oh, thank goodness, because we were like stuck. And he, bless him, went right out of his way to drive us to the entrance of the park, make sure we got there safely. He was obviously a Christian, and we shared stories and stuff. But it was one of those moments when genuinely there was a kind of like, oh gosh, we've got ourselves in a bit of a pickle here. And you sort of suddenly realise we didn't have mobile phones, none of that, there wouldn't have been coverage anyway if we had. So it was kind of one of those moments which is just emblazoned on my memory of God kind of just being so gracious and stepping in for this kind of these young 20-somethings who had kind of not really thought it through and brought us safely to where we were supposed to be. So yeah, that was a fun one.
Wonderful. So it was just a special time in general, was it?
It was. I think, again, you can kind of be a bit twee about these things, but genuinely that time, we got far more out of it than we could ever have given to the people we were there to serve. We were there to sort of do the sort of, we were on a kind of traditional mission base with a church, a hospital, a school, and we got involved in education and serving the church and all kinds of things. And it was just an amazing time. And you just realise how extraordinarily generous people are with relatively little. And, we were sort of treated so hospitably everywhere we went. And it just kind of changed the way we look at the world quite significantly, I think, from that point onwards. It's something I wish everyone could do at that kind of age. Yeah. It would just completely change the way people live their lives, I think, when you actually kind of step out of your Western bubble and see that. And just provision in all kinds of different ways. God provided. In getting there in the first place, we didn't have much money, but there were all kinds of things that happened where people gave just the right amount of money that we needed at that moment to be able to let us take the next step on the journey. All of that stuff, it's kind of, you do feel like you're in the hands of God in a way that, as I say, you don't always feel like you have to be, if you will, in other ways.
Yeah, I absolutely resonate with that. And I look back, my year out before going to university was in South Africa, and it was such a miserable year out, extreme extrovert, living by myself in the middle of nowhere. Having baboons tear down my thatch rondavel. It was beautiful, but cripplingly alone. And for me, it's like I'm stripped of everything. I've got no friends. I've got no fellowship. I'm on my own. And if I can be totally blunt, it was like, what are you going to do, Simon? You're on your own. You're either going to get holy or sleep with the farm women and get AIDS. It seemed that stark a choice. And thank God he became very real in my utter desperation. And he provided on all sorts of levels. And it's a key building block for the rest of my life. And then, years later, when God called me to Burundi from the get-go, I love it. You'll have these stories from that time, but I remember from day one, first email arrived in Burundi, I've had all my money stolen, and I'm sort of shafted, unless God is real, unless it's true that the one who calls you is faithful and he will do it. And first email I send out saying, guys, I need a computer. And my friend of mine in London wakes up and praise God, I've got this computer. I feel like you're telling me to give it to someone. Show me who. Boom! First opens it up and there's a request from Central Africa. And you look back, don't you, at key moments where God has provided. It's crystal clear that as you step out in risk-taking in faith, that Yeah, the one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. 1 Thessalonians 5:24. So we don't have to go chronologically, but I'm interested. You come back. I mean, now you do loads of podcasting, writing, and touring and speaking. Was that always going to be the trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, as I say my ministry and my wife's ministry have both kind of gone hand in hand. So she started training for ministry at a theological college when we returned. I started Christian journalism, essentially, started learning the ropes of radio, worked for Premier Christian Radio, and did work for them for over 20 years. So a long spell doing different things, first live radio, then, but about 3 years in began what came to be called The Unbelievable Show with a question mark. And that was really me taking that apologetic stuff, the intellectual defense of the faith, and really kind of putting it out there in the public square, bringing Christians and non-Christians together for weekly dialogues and debates. And we were fairly early adopters of this podcasting thing that's now so ubiquitous, but back in 2007, it wasn't when we began. So we were very early adopters of that. And it just grew organically until at some point, actually, there were more people listening on podcasts than on radio, and people listening all over the world. And not just Christians, because a lot of non-Christians started listening, a lot of atheists, agnostics, because I was bringing on, if you like, their champions to do these dialogues and debates with Christian thinkers. And so that was just an incredibly interesting time. I learned an awful lot along the way. And I kind of got to see the way in which, there can be this really helpful aspect of Christian witness, which is about showing the intellectual reasonableness of Christianity. But it was done in such a different way. It wasn't like a talk or a lecture. It was because it was this dialogue between two people with very different views. It was quite engaging, sometimes threatening. I think, not all the Christians who listened on radio liked it, because it was kind of challenging sometimes to listen to a cogent atheist. But actually, I think there were enough people who listened who thought, no, we need this. We need to get out of our bubble. We need to be able to engage with this stuff in real life. And I think it gave a lot of people the tools to go and do that, have good conversations with their friends, to understand the other side better. But at the same time, it was this extraordinary sort of pre-evangelistic kind of square, this kind of open forum where non-Christians could listen and get involved. And, we ended up creating, online forums where they would dialogue and debate as well. So it was this really interesting, fertile place where we created a meeting ground, essentially. And I tried to do my best to be as neutral as I could as the person in the moderator's chair, trying just to bring the best arguments out of both sides and not kind of jerry-rigging the results. If it didn't all go in favor of the Christian one week, that was just the way the chips fell that week. But I think what happened was especially for the atheists and agnostics who listened, many of whom were very kind of ardently anti-Christian very often. This was the era of the new atheists and so on. I think a lot of them just realized after you listen to 10 shows on the trot, even if you disagree, it's harder to say Christianity is just a load of fairy tales and nonsense, because you've heard intelligent people making an intelligent case for Christianity. And whether or not they've persuaded you, it's much harder, I think, to just dismiss it. So I almost felt like a lot of the time, while we were just often softening the ground, almost giving people like ears to hear almost. And very often I felt like we were doing that very early work of just making it possible for people to take Christianity seriously. We often didn't see the full results of that, but I felt like we were doing some important early work in some of the cases of the most hardened skeptics, if you will, who were listening and engaging.
Yeah. Well, obviously it hit the spot because in the end, millions and millions of people tuned in. It's had a fantastic impact. So I guess that's what brought you to a certain level of prominence and gave you a good platform to launch into, the surprising rebirth of belief in God. That's been beautiful. I've tracked with that all the way and I've absolutely loved those. And I think that's one similarity between our podcasts is that, I listen to even some other Christian podcasts and certainly the political podcasts, and most of them I come off feeling riled and angry.
Oh, tell me about it.
Whereas yours is one of the few, and obviously inspired. The whole point is that we leave inspired and encouraged in our faith. But I'd come off all of yours thinking, yes, come on, God's on his throne. It's brilliant. It's exciting. So tell us about that journey.
Yeah. So what happened basically was that, in 17 plus years of hosting The Unbelievable Show, we went on a really interesting journey because it began, as I say, in the heyday of new atheism, this very aggressive anti-Christian thing. These best-selling so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, all with their own best-selling anti-God books. And I don't know if you remember even the atheist bus campaign of the mid-2000s. That was this sort of, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. This was the kind of milieu that we were speaking into at the time. And so there were a lot of these kind of quite full-on debates, set pieces. We even did like big London debates between big Christian thinkers and atheists and all that sort of thing. And that was kind of the right response to that, what was happening in the culture. But I did notice over time that the conversations did begin to change quite drastically, especially towards the end of the 2010s, around 2017, 2018. And I honestly felt like the new atheist thing had dropped off quite dramatically. There's a whole backstory there that I won't go into now, but you can read in the book and here on the podcast series about the way the new atheist movement itself kind of fractured internally, because once they'd agreed God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, there was very little else it turned out they could agree on. They started having all kinds of fallouts. But anyway, that aside, I think it ultimately just didn't really answer people's deeper existential questions. And so I think people started to go looking for new sages in the secular culture. And I just noticed that the people who were now popping up were not nearly as antagonistic to Christian faith. They were quite sympathetic, actually, to the value of faith, even if they didn't believe it. So I was seeing people like Tom Holland, the historian in the UK, now massively popular through his own Rest is History podcast, but writing this book Dominion about the way in which Christianity has actually completely shaped the moral instincts of the West. And I was bringing him on for conversations. And interestingly, although he wasn't exactly a Christian, he was kind of in the Christian seat opposite, atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling, really spectacular show I was able to put him into conversation with. Or Jordan Peterson, who's become very well known as this sort of Canadian psychologist, pointing people back to the value of the Bible as a kind of founding story for life. And again, difficult to nail down where he is on the God spectrum, but opening the door, certainly, for lots of other people to potentially walk through. So I was bumping into all these characters, bringing them on the show, getting them in dialogue and debate. And I just thought something's changed in the atmosphere. There seems to be this new openness. And it was particularly one conversation I had with Douglas Murray, who's quite a well-known, conservative cultural critic. And again, he's not a Christian. Any faith he had, he kind of lost in his sort of early 20s, I think. But I had him on a conversation with N.T. Wright. It's quite a well-known New Testament historian. And they were kind of debating sort of post-Christian culture and that kind of thing. And he quoted this well-worn phrase by the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. It's sort of been an image for the way that faith has gone out on the West over the last 150 years or so. And he said to me, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, this was Douglas Murray speaking, this thing about the sea of faith is it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And he was saying this from the perspective of someone who was calling himself in that show a Christian atheist. He said, I don't believe in Christianity, but I've come to realize it's completely shaped the way I think about life. I am a product of a Christian culture, basically. So I'm a very Christian atheist, is what he was saying. Yeah. And he was noticing, interestingly, among his secular peers, a surprising number who were becoming Christians. People like thinking 21st century people who were suddenly saying, I've decided I'm going to jump into this Christian story. And so he was the person who made me think, yeah, something's changed. The tide is turning. And that's kind of really where the surprising rebirth of belief in God came from, both the book and podcast series. I wanted to kind of try and encapsulate this and show all the different ways in culture, history, science, academia, philosophy, lots of ways I'd been seeing the God hypothesis becoming possible again. You weren't laughed out of the room if you said, well, maybe there is a God. And I think in a funny way, that book was published in summer 2023. And just at that moment, it seemed to catch a wave of lots of stuff starting to happen in culture, which has, for me, sort of confirmed the hypothesis. And it's been absolutely the grace of God that I happened to kind of stumble on this, if you like, see this kind of from my vantage point, and then to suddenly see, lots of other things seem to be confirming this as well.
Well, we'll put a link to the surprising rebirth of belief in God for the book and the podcast, guys. You can track back, and it's I'm not going to say it's timeless because things are shifting quite fast, but certainly for the next few years, deeply, deeply relevant to engage with in terms of what's going on in our time, in our culture. So, give some of the highlights, like Paul Kingsnorth as an example.
Yeah. So, obviously I bumped into converts, throughout all the years I was doing Unbelievable. One of the lovely stories is actually that one of the people I work most closely with now, who is sort of my operations manager for my little production company, is a guy called Peter Byram, and he was an atheist. He grew up in a Christian family, but sort of lost his faith and was very much enamored with the new atheist by the time he went to university. But it was really through, interestingly, apologetics to some stumbling, funnily enough, because he was watching Richard Dawkins, and then he was starting to see, there were people responding, this funny Christian philosophers. He started to engage Christian apologetics, stumbled upon The Unbelievable Show, and ended up actually, even while he was still an agnostic, helping us put on a big kind of debate tour with William Lane Craig, a well-known Christian philosopher, back in 2011. And I saw Peter, as I made friends with him, go on this journey of just gradually questioning all of his atheist assumptions and finally kind of submitting to Christ. And so we now work very closely together. But that's just one example of the way in which I've seen that journey happen, that intellectual journey, but where someone's finally had to admit they're not the God of their own life. They've got to kind of yield themselves to Christ. But that kind of was those sorts of stories were, I think, early indicators of what seems to be happening with more regularity now. And so, you mentioned Paul Kingsnorth, someone I talk about in the book and interview for the series. He's another fascinating example of these secular intellectuals starting to take faith seriously. His story is, in a nutshell, is that he's now a well-known, celebrated author and poet. He's got a background in environmental activism. And so he kind of bounced around between different religious traditions. He kind of had a long spell as a teenage atheist, religion's all a bunk, Then he kind of got into a long spell in Buddhism. And that kind of matched his kind of environmental concerns to some extent. Mm-hmm. But the way he puts it is, he said he always felt somewhat dissatisfied with Buddhism because it's about basically looking inside. And he felt this desire to worship, he says. And he loved being in nature. He's kind of a man of the woods and the mountains, loved being out there. And so he literally thought, at some point, he thought, well, maybe I could worship and maybe I could kind of worship nature. And so he became Wiccan. He joined a Wiccan group that went, to do kind of rituals and ceremonies in the woods. And he said it was kind of all fun, but he kind of realized within a year or two that it was basically, in hindsight, a kind of bastardized version of Christianity. It was this sort of strange mishmash of esoteric New Age beliefs and Christian things all put together in this sort of heretical way, basically. And he also realized that whatever spiritual component there was to this, it wasn't actually a positive one. So he started having all kinds of experiences. He ran a writing school, and suddenly he says, people seem to be popping up all over the place who were Christians, vicars who were, messaging him and asking for thoughts on their sermon and things. And he was like, what's going on here? He started having dreams about Jesus. And even his wife, who was not a Christian, one evening out of the blue, without any prompting, said to him, you're going to become a Christian. And he was like, what are you talking about? Of course, I'm not going to become a Christian. But within a couple of years, he had become a Christian. And the way he put it to me was that Jesus sort of dragged him almost kicking and screaming out of Wicca. He was, like Lewis, the most reluctant convert. He did not see himself becoming a Christian. In his mind, Christianity was this sort of oppressive, thing, but once he understood it, once he started reading about it, once he started actually engaging C.S. Lewis, reading the Bible, he suddenly realized, I've had this completely the wrong way around. I never really understood this. And he became a Christian. Interestingly, he looked around and finally found his home in the Eastern Orthodox Church, very ancient stream of Christianity. So Paul lives in Ireland and goes to a Romanian Orthodox church. So it's a kind of it's an unusual situation, which he freely admits himself. But he found there, I think, particularly in the Orthodox tradition, a sort of a depth to the to the ritual and the way in which they engage faith that really just suited him as a storyteller, as a mystic at some level. And he's become a fascinating voice for Christianity, one of these surprising rebirth stories. And there's quite a few of them out there. So he's just one interesting example of, the kinds of people who are suddenly finding themselves drawn to faith who never expected it.
Mm. We were a few months ago, we were at the ARC conference in London, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and there were so many people there who were so close in terms of being on the journey. I think of Konstantin Kissin. I mean, he does a podcast called Trigonometry that has gone pretty stratospheric. He's got 1.2 million subscribers. And I was listening to him one time driving back 6 a.m. from preaching in Birmingham. So Monday morning, driving back in the dark. And I was listening to a podcast, and the guy he was interviewing was an atheist who's painting such a dystopian, bleak view of where we're headed. And Constant asked him, so, this is so dire. What is the hope? And this, I forget the guy's name. This atheist replied, well, the hope is, and I'm saying this as an atheist, is that we come back to God. And I am literally slapping my forehead and not holding the steering wheel as I'm driving. And then Constantine goes, you're so right. And me and my wife, we know we've started saying grace before meals, even though we don't believe in God. And again, I'm slapping my voice. I said, come on, Constant. I got home immediately. I wrote to him. I said, Constant, you show so much integrity, intellectual integrity in general, in your pursuit for answers that are uncomfortable. But the only areas that you won't actually check out Jesus. Come on, I'll do an alpha course with you. Anyway, I didn't get a reply.
I think God's on the case of Constantine. I mean, he's described himself, I've heard him describe himself as a lapsed atheist, basically. And I'm meeting a lot of these lapsed atheists. And the common theme is that they've become disillusioned with liberal humanist kind of values. They've realized it's a dead end. It doesn't actually bring life. And they've realized they've all essentially intellectually at some level been converted by the Tom Holland thesis that actually it was Christianity that gave us all of these values of freedom, equality, dignity, progress. All of that actually has its base in a story. And they're all wondering, how can we sustain those values without the story that birthed them, basically? So, but they kind of find themselves stranded at this point because they can't go back to where they came from. They can't go back to this kind of almost naive view about just, a secular utopia. If we all just believe in science and reason, it'll all kind of be fine. That did not work out. All we got by abandoning the Christian story and replacing it with a technological story is a lot of confusion, culture war, mental health crisis. It's basically been a really bad thing. And so everyone gets that. Everyone sees that we can't go back. But where do you go to? And a lot of these sort of intellectuals like Konstantin Kissin find themselves kind of like, I think, quite attracted to Christianity, but it's just that. But there is something about submitting yourself to something that's bigger than you that's quite difficult for a lot of people. And there's a certain amount of humility required. And I think that it's the tricky thing. And I've been talking to so many people in that position, and she's quite frank about it. So I think it's fine for me to mention this. Louise Perry is an interesting example of this as someone who was brought up in the typical kind of secular feminist kind of mode, through university, just absolutely took on board all of the kind of sexual revolution sort of politics of men and women and relationships and everything. And it was only really working in a rape crisis centre after university that she started to question that whole thing. She ended up writing this extraordinary book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which purely from a socio-cultural evolutionary perspective said this has been bad for us, this sexual revolution, bad for women, bad for children. The only people gaining are certain types of men, basically. And she came to surprisingly Christian conclusions by the end of it, against her expectations. She said, well, that's funnily enough, in doing all this research, it turns out there was one institution which turns out to have been relatively good, despite all its flaws, relatively good at putting guardrails on male sexuality, leading to the flourishing of families, communities, whole nations. And it's this funny old institution called monogamous Christian marriage. And she just worked this out purely by looking at the kind of scientific side and the historical side. She doesn't quote the Bible at any point in the book. And yet this journey has led her to the point where she's realized, I need a better story. We all need a better story. And she's going to church. And she's kind of, as she put it to me, trying to get her disenchanted brain to kind of come to terms with the fact there might be more. So I meet people on this journey all the time who are these lapsed atheists who are now can't go back to where they came from, but they're just struggling, to kind of make that step into trusting in Jesus, basically. Yeah.
Who would be the most significant convert recently, do you reckon?
So of the people who have converted, I mean, it has, as I say, once I published the book, suddenly it felt like people were coming out of the woodwork everywhere. You obviously very high profile people like Russell Brand becoming, very overt about sudden faith they'd found. Obviously, he's some somewhat controversial example with allegations outstanding against him and so on. But one of the ones I focused on more in the podcast series is Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
We were together, weren't we, at ARC?
Yeah.
She was brilliant again.
Yeah, very interesting. Again, just very briefly, for those who don't know her story, she comes from Somalia originally, war-torn country, fled the Muslim Brotherhood regime, this sort of fundamentalist Islamic regime. Escaping a forced marriage, she came to the Netherlands and became a sort of political activist, human rights activist, but very much a secular one. She rejected religion. She wanted nothing to do with it. She became great friends with Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, became essentially the fifth horsewoman of the new atheism, sharing stage with them, wrote her own best-selling anti-God book, Infidel. And so that was why it was so shocking when in November 2023, she publishes this viral article called Why I Am Now a Christian. And her story just seemed to encapsulate what I'd just published in The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because she had been this new atheist, but she'd realized it cannot sustain the values of Western liberal democracy. You need the Christian story. So she'd kind of at an intellectual level been converted to that. And lots of people said when they read the article, oh, this is just a cultural, political conversion or something. But actually she did talk briefly in the article and then in more depth later about her personal journey. And again, very briefly, she said she'd been on this kind of personal journey where she'd experienced a meaning crisis in her life, completely nihilistic kind of way of looking at life. She couldn't see what the point of life was. She became very depressed, alcoholic, went to lots of counselors trying to find a sort of material scientific cure. None of it worked. Till finally one counselor said to her, Ayaan, I think you're spiritually bankrupt. Have you ever tried praying? And Ayaan says to her, well, I couldn't pray. The God I was raised with was a monster. To which this counselor says to her, well, what kind of God could you believe in? If you could describe the kind of God you'd be willing to believe in. And so Ayaan says, in her own words, she started to describe the kind of God she might be willing to believe in. And she realized as she was doing that she was essentially describing Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And so she thought, well, maybe I don't need to invent a new God. Maybe I need to investigate this person who claimed to be God. And so she tried praying and she started going to church. And again, in her own words, she said God turned her life upside down.
Yeah.
The depression evaporated. She found this new purpose. She wrote this viral article. Her husband, Neil Ferguson, very well-respected historian, also speaker at the Art Conference, he was so shocked by the change in his wife. He became a Christian as well. They were both baptized, in September 2024.
Fantastic.
They're going to church. They're very early in their state, and I do feel for those people who are kind of having to live out this conversion in public, because there's a lot of pressure on them and so on. But it's also very encouraging, to see those kinds of stories coming out. So that would be one very specific conversion story that I think has had an outsized impact, that her story really went all around the world and has been quite significant. I mean, who's next? That's the question. I mean, I've even heard talk of, I don't think he's converted, as it were, but Joe Rogan apparently has said he's going to church. And it's interesting, you see someone like him, the biggest podcast host in the world by a long way. And I noticed from about 2 or 3 years ago, he was starting to just have a lot more Christians of some sort or another on his show. And this was someone who was very much, someone who just brought on the new atheist types, going back. But I just noticed, again, this turning of the tide, there's a kind of openness. And so who knows who might be next? But it feels like there's just been a really number of interesting stories. Now, we don't put all our hope in celebrities converting or anything like that, but it does give a sense that the atmosphere has changed at the moment.
It is very encouraging. You're just coming out with a new book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, new book is called Why I'm Still a Christian. After some 20 years now of talking with atheists and agnostics, it's really, whereas the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book is sort of looking at the cultural changes that have been going on and why we would do well to kind of lean in now to the ways in which we can reach our culture. Why I'm Still a Christian is really a sort of primer for anyone who wants good reasons for belief in God. For someone who's asking those kinds of questions, who's questioning their atheism, this is the kind of book you could give them and say, well, look, here's a case for faith. Without wanting to compare myself with people like C.S. Lewis, it's trying to do that mere Christianity thing. But the difference with this book is it comes out of all the conversations that I've been privileged to host between Christians and non-Christians. And I've sort of tried to distill what I think are the really core arguments, the best arguments from where I'm standing for God, how the best arguments responding to some of those classic objections around suffering, evil, and that kind of thing. And trying just to make the case to say it's perfectly intellectually acceptable to believe in God. In fact, it probably makes a lot of sense to do so. And here's some reasons why. And yeah, I hope that it'll encourage Christians who, buy the material, but it'll also be the kind of book that hopefully you could pass to that non-Christian friend who's having thoughts about it.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put that in the blurb. And the beautiful thing about books, I've written a number of books, is that they just get to places you cannot imagine. And you hear 5-10 years later, that book changed my life. It's nothing more encouraging than that, is there? Now, just to bring it, so, you've got this big platform ministry, media is it can be beautifully used in terms of sharing good news. So that's the big scale thing. Let's bring it back down to you. If you're not preaching, speaking somewhere at the weekend, what will home and church life look like?
So my wife is a minister of our local church here in Woking, where I live. And so that's a lot of, my time and energy being a husband, a father, but also being involved in local church. So I help to lead worship on Sundays. Most Sundays you'll find me strumming a guitar, doing my best to lead worship. I'm quite involved in our youth work, do a little bit of sort of stuff on the publicity side for the church. And it's just, for me, I was saying to someone this the other day, it really is helpful actually to kind of be very grounded in a local church, because it sort of keeps your feet on the ground. You could, because I do end up talking with a lot of, interesting thought leaders and people, in those intellectual spheres, it might make you think, oh, Christianity is just this sort of intellectual thing or whatever. And what being in a local church does, and just being on the ground with people where they are, it makes you realize, no, that's not really the point of it all. It's about living lives faithfully for Jesus in this, wherever we find ourselves. And that's just a joy to be doing that. We've been, believe it or not, I said that Lucy started training for ministry shortly after we got married, when we came back from Africa. And so 3 years of training, 1 year of which was in a sort of very multicultural church in Tottenham in London, led to us beginning, with the church back in 2005. So our oldest son, who's now 20, was less than a year old at the time. But so we've been there nearly 20 years. And that's quite unusual to be in your first church for 20 years, but it's been the right place for Lucy and for the whole family. And it's just means we've been able to put down roots, and just, it's so good to be able to, for instance, see kids born in the church, grow up in the church, be baptized, and go on into faith. There's something if you moved on every 5 years, you just wouldn't have the opportunity necessarily to see those kinds of beautiful stories over time, and just to walk with people through long periods of their life. I mean, just at the time of recording, about a week ago, we had some fantastic news in our church. This goes back about 17 years. Young black South African guy called Fusi joined our church in 2006. He was engaged to be married to Nancy, and they were both from South Africa, working on student visas in the UK. And a couple of years later, 2008, he'd just been to Spring Harvest with a group from our church. And the day after he got back, he got suddenly picked up by sort of immigration authorities who were raiding the house that he was staying in, looking for someone else who had lived there previously, but wasn't in fact there any longer. And he just got picked up along with these other people. And because he didn't have his passport with him, it was with the Home Office at the time, he basically just got deported without any recourse to a lawyer or anything. And he was just basically told, look, sort it out from South Africa. This led to basically a 15-month battle for us to help Fusi return, because he'd been illegally deported. went all the way to a tribunal at the High Court in London. And we basically, he was in a sense, he was someone who had a church who had his back. But there are so many people, it reminded us, who don't in those circumstances. He was able to return. There was great celebrations when that happened. This is still going back to 2009. But that led to a whole kind of period in his life where he was just pushed from pillar to post, trying to get some settled status. He's been incredibly involved in the church, in our youth work. He married Nancy. Tragically, they both continued to have these problems, and a couple of times were taken into detention centres. Again, some terrible stories to do with that. On the second occasion that happened in 2018, Nancy fell quite ill and very sadly died a couple of weeks later. And that was just a tragedy for everyone, and obviously heartbreaking for Fusi, the whole church. But we supported him through it, and we never gave up the fight. And he sometimes wanted to give it up, but we kind of stood by him as a church. And then, so this has been an ongoing thing, and he's been dependent to some extent on the hospitality of the church, and he lived with us for a few months. Him and his wife Nancy at one point. He's lived with other people. And finally, just a week ago, as of this recording, he got leave to remain. It just came out of the blue. And I can tell you, it felt like a miracle to us, this 17-year-long thing. And we just threw a party that evening. We just got everyone round. We had Fusi round. There were lots of tears, lots of laughter. We just celebrated in church on Sunday. We had all the young people who he's so precious to, because he's very involved in our youth work, come up and lay hands on him, and just thanking God for this, basically what in our church feels like a miracle at the end of this 17-year journey for Fusi. So that is when church just feels like what church is meant to be. It's like, it's the family of God coming together, looking out for each other, going through all the highs and lows, the tragedies, the heartbreak, but kind of holding on to faith, holding on to hope, being there for each other. We prayed, there were prayer groups, and Fusi was on that prayer list week in, week out for the last 17 years. In fact, when my wife received the news from Fusi on Tuesday morning, our youth and children's prayer group were meeting that morning, as they do every week. And she went in and she said it was the first time I'd stopped people from praying, because I said, guys, stop praying. We've just had an answer to prayer. And so it was just those kind of moments just give you so much hope that in the midst of so much bad news, as you say, there is a God who's working and who's so faithful. And it was just an extraordinary moment last week when that happened.
Wonderful. You mentioned Woking. So Woking, which is quite a random place, isn't it? It's not much.
It's not the cultural capital of the UK. I'll give you that. We have the not so great privilege of being one of the only councils in the UK to have gone bankrupt, which is ridiculous in a relatively affluent place like Surrey to have gone bankrupt. But there you go. It happened.
But it's a very precious place to me, because it was there on Guildford Road. I was working for Going Places at the time. And it was in 1998, July the 12th maybe. And a guy had tracked me down in the city. I'd been in the city on the Friday, and he'd come to me and he said, I believe God sent me to you and he wants to go to Burundi. And I had been praying, God, I'll do anything, I'll go anywhere. So on the Monday, I was back at my job in Woking on Guildford Road, and I said, God, right now in front of the computer, if that wasn't some nut job, if that was you sending him to get me to go to Burundi, well, that would mean leaving family, friends, security, career, everything. I might get killed, and people tried to kill me in the meantime. So give me a radical sign right now in front of the computer on Guildford Road at Going Places head office. If you want me to go to Burundi, give me a sign about Burundi. And the phone rang, and I picked it up, and the voice on the other end said, do you know anyone who wants to work in Burundi? And that phone call swung my life. And that's why I'm doing this podcast now. That's why I went to Brierley for 20 years, 26 years of involvement there. And so Woking is a very precious place.
I love it. I love that. I never knew that. I never knew that the Guildford Road in Woking was a significant milestone turning point in your ministry. How about
absolutely.
that? I love it.
Amazing. Now, listen, as we sort of come into land, I just want to set you up really, and sort of, can you sort of conclude and lead us in, and what would you blast at us in terms of encouragement and what you see happening in the nation? Go for it.
Well, I think we've lived through a long period of secularization. We live in this very post-Christian culture, and the attitude, as you say, has often been one of kind of cynicism, despair. And when you look at the national church, honestly, you can understand why. We often, just mess things up so badly, don't we, in all kinds of ways. So it's not that there's nothing to be kind of upset or disillusioned about. But at the same time, I've become convinced that God is in the habit of surprising us, It's often when the church looks like it's on its knees that God's about to raise her up. And sometimes we have to be humbled in order to be able to actually be ready for what God might be bringing. And I just feel like we're in one of those moments. There's a quote by G.K. Chesterton where he says, Christendom has died and been reborn many times. It's had a series of deaths and rebirths, but it has always been reborn because it has a God who knew his way out of the grave. And I just feel that we're in one of those stepping out of the grave moments. Yes, the statistics have all been in one direction in Western culture for a long time. Church decline. Here in the UK, for the first time, at the last census, more people than not said they weren't Christian. And a lot of people just think, oh, well, that's the end of the story. Christianity is becoming irrelevant. Secularism takes over. But I honestly believe actually that's not the full story. And there's all kinds of interesting data points suggesting things are changing. I'm hearing story after story from church leaders, for instance, of just this change in the atmosphere around them, an openness to God, people literally walking in, not even being invited, just turning up. And this is happening across quite a wide variety of different types of churches, Catholic, Orthodox, charismatic, evangelical. And just something's shifted. Gen Z, with lots of research now coming out saying they're the most open generation. Now that can take lots of different forms, all kinds of esoteric stuff, crystals, manifesting, whatever. But actually, they're also the generation that are most likely to say yes to an invitation to church or to Alpha or to something. Yeah. Far more than their parents or grandparents. They're half as likely to be atheists. And I think the reason for this, Simon, partly is because because they never grew up in a Christian culture, Gen Z, they've almost got nothing to kick against. They've got nothing to reject. And so there's this ironic thing that it's a kind of a blank sheet. And actually that God can do something sometimes with that. And I'm hearing story after story of young people coming to faith right now. Yeah. Lots of, interestingly, the missing demographic across all our churches for a long time has been young men. They're the ones most likely to be turning up in church right now. And some of it's coming from these online influencers, the Jordan Petersons and so on. But there's also just this spiritual hunger that's manifesting. Yeah. People are desperate. I think they've tried everything else, and they've tried all the kind of quasi-religious stories about, on the progressive left, gender and identity, on the right, political mythologies, whatever. None of it's satisfying. All of it's leaving them empty. We've got this meaning crisis, this mental health crisis. I think people reach a point where they're desperate enough that they'll go back to the source. And I just sense this is the moment when that's happening. And I think the church needs to lean into this and to kind of tell its story confidently again. And to kind of own the weirdness of it as well. One of the things that's come out in a lot of these conversations I've had with these secular intellectuals like Tom Holland and others is they're actually looking for something really different to what the culture's offering them. They're looking for the weird. They're actually quite open to the supernatural, believe it or not. And so let's not kind of soft pedal Christianity. It is a challenge. It's ethically challenging. It calls you into something, a life of discipleship. It's got all these bizarre supernatural claims, but actually that's actually quite attractive now to people. They're looking for something. So keep Christianity weird. Let's be confident with the story, and let's hold out this community of people in an age where we're so isolated from each other by digital devices, where people want to cancel each other left, right and center. There's still this place where you can show up with a bunch of other people and you love each other. You try to forgive each other, you annoy each other, but by the grace of God, you kind of gather around something bigger than yourself. And I think people are actually really desperate for that right now. It's one of the few places you can still find that. So I think this is the moment to own the beauty of the church, the weirdness of the church, and the attraction that's there. I think it's time to be confident again that we have the story that makes sense of people's lives. People are ready to hear it again. I just want to encourage people, just if you're feeling beat up, cynical, pessimistic, now's the time to maybe look upwards again and see what God's doing.
Amen. You know, you as a student, you're at St. Aldate's Church. We had a few months ago, we had Stephen Foster, who's the leader there, share mind-blowing stories every single week. Multiple people are coming to faith there. So God is doing a new thing in this nation. There is a new openness, particularly in the younger demographic. And then last week, I was with Pete Winter of St. Paul's Hammersmith, and he talked about these youngsters, youth in his church. He said, we want to give out Bibles. And they started it off their own bat, using their own money. And now the church got behind it now, because they've given out thousands of Bibles. Wow. And there's an endless stream of people that have been coming in saying, oh, someone gave me a Bible on the street a few weeks ago and I've been reading it and I want to have my answers. Stunning stuff. So guys, I want us to be encouraged that we're special, and this is for those of us particularly in the UK context. I know not every listener is, but I think God is doing a new thing. That the narrative has been so bleak and so depressing and so obviously isn't working for people in terms of how many people are struggling with mental health issues and that sort of thing. It just made me think of that lovely little line, that little sort of phrase of Ivan Illich, who was an Austrian philosopher. And he was asked whether it's more effective to change society through violent revolution or gradual reform. And he said, neither. He said, if you want to change society, you must tell an alternative story. And folks, as we close out now, I just love that, telling an alternative story, a story of hope, of meaning, of purpose, of grace. There's so little grace. There's no forgiveness in cancel culture, of sacrifice, of having time for our neighbor, of going the extra mile, of joy. I mean, all the fruit of the Spirit, isn't it? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such thing there is no law. Bring it on. Well, listen, Justin, I am cheering you on. I'm looking forward to your next round of podcasts coming out, because I loved it on my long drives around the country engaging with you. So keep up the good work. We hope that we'll put all the details in the book and the podcast in the blurb. God bless you, brother. Thanks for being on it.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Simon. God bless you. Thank you for all the encouragement you're bringing as well.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Okay, folks, I'm sure you've been inspired. Can you please gossip the podcast to mates, people who you know will be edified and challenged and stirred from this? It'd be great if you give us a good review on Spotify and iTunes. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, a very different story, another fantastic guest. But in the meantime, God bless you and toodaloo.